Well, hello, and welcome back to my virtual sofa. Great to see you again. And my very special guest today is our second horn at the Stamford Symphony, the wonderful Eva Conti. Eva, hello, welcome. How are you?
Hello. I'm doing pretty well, considering we're doing well.
You're looking well. How are you coping with not playing and the lockdowns?
Well, it's been a interesting trajectory from when this started to now. I started out sort of in panic mode and practicing furiously, and then maybe not practicing furiously for a little bit, and then getting involved in sewing projects and all these different things as demands started to, can you make me masks? Can you make a video? All that kind of stuff was sort of hard to juggle. Now things have sort of gotten into a routine where I'm teaching on certain days of the week, and I'm taking classes with some Spanish dancers in Spain, and I've sort of found some interesting things to do. Practicing has gotten to sort of more regular routine, but it's definitely been an interesting time. I can say that, I'm sure, for everybody.
Now, I was just reading the 802 Musicians Union magazine here in New York, where you're the featured artist this edition. The article is called French Horn and Flamenco, and it's a very good read. And I think it's up on the Stamford Symphony channel right now, so I would encourage everybody to read that. And I want to come back, obviously, to the whole flamenco side of your life, which is fascinating, and we've seen some of it at Stamford Symphony. But let's go back and talk about your musical start. And I didn't know you played classical guitar, for instance, until I did that. So,
yeah, I've made it through many instruments.
Go back to the beginning. How did it start, and where does your love of music come from?
Well, my family was very musical. My mother was an amateur but classical pianist, so she was always playing Chopin and different things at the piano all the time. There was always music in the house. My father was a jazz saxophone player, and then later played jazz piano, not as a profession. He did start out that way, but then he ended up leaving that. So there was always people in the house playing music. A lot of bebop, he was a bebop guy, so there were a lot of people in the house playing. And so I probably didn't even mention this in the article, but probably the first thing I ever played was cymbals, where he would have the cymbals set up near the piano, and dee, da, dee, da, 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 I had to learn to do that. So maybe that started my love of rhythm. But after I started to play flute and piano, piano was my very first instrument, because we always had a piano in the house. And then flute when I got into grade school. And my sister played flute and she was older, so I wanted to copy her. So I did learn the flute. And then as I moved along through school, I got interested in the guitar. And when I think it was maybe 8th grade, there was a group that met after school, but the prerequisite is you had to be able to play already. So I did not play yet. And so we were driving down to Florida, one of our many Christmas vacations down to Florida, and I brought the guitar and I learned to play the guitar in the back seat. I told the teacher that I did play before I left for Christmas vacation, and so then I learned to play in the back seat on the way to Florida and on the way back, so that I truly could play when I got home. And I joined the group. So that's how that started with the guitar. And I basically learned, folk guitar and things like that. And then when I got into high school, I was playing the flute. They asked me to try the French horn. So I thought, okay. So I gave it a try, and it sort of took to it right away. And I, continued playing guitar, and I was sort of doing both those instruments sort of simultaneously, but I wasn't really studying guitar until later. And so I guess when I got to college, went to college for biology. I sort of was on the periphery of the music department and got involved playing in the orchestra, and was playing the horn at that point. And then classical guitar really grabbed me. And so I started to study classical guitar, and then I ended up getting a degree in classical guitar from University of Rhode Island, and I got my degree in biology at the same time. And all the side was playing French horn. So it was full of different music.
But you went on to really major with the horn, and that is your primary instrument. You're also the principal horn at the New Haven Symphony, just along the coast in Connecticut.
22 years, yeah.
Right. But you talk a lot about your almost apprenticeship in Israel when you left school and you had a job in Israel where you
Yes, I played.
played all sorts of repertoire. Tell us about that.
So I got a job with the principal horn of it's now called the New Israeli Opera. So we were the opera orchestra in Tel Aviv, and that orchestra worked every single day of the week. Their idea of a weekend is Friday night from sundown to Saturday sundown. So you would play rehearsals on Friday and then a concert Saturday night. So that was your day off. So you were constantly working. And in that orchestra, we did opera, obviously, and then we also would do orchestral concerts, some school programs and things like that. But it was their idea of pops there is maybe light classics here. So you really never went into the pops realm, and everything you played was regular classical repertoire. So I was sort of, baptism with a fire hose of repertoire. Just learned everything, and was working, 7 days a week. I did that job for 2 years, and then later played in a group called the Camerata in Jerusalem, and then I used to sub in the Israel Philharmonic, and luckily got to do a lot of the tours in Mahler symphonies. It's Maestro Maida loves Mahler, so there are a lot of extra horns in that. So I was lucky enough to be involved with some of those recordings and tours.
That must have been a very exciting time to.
It was very interesting. I mean, it was an interesting group to travel with.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this was back in the 90s, and so it was right after the Gulf War. And I mean, the security that I experienced traveling with a group like that it was very alien to the United States at that time. Now we're more used to seeing, the TSA and all the stuff at the airports, but, every place the Israel Philharmonic went, there would be dogs, or any Israel orchestra, not just that orchestra, but there'd be dogs sniffing, bomb sniffing dogs everywhere, and lots of police and security people with you, traveling with you all the time.
Mm. So you come back to the United States, and as you said, you've been principal horn in New Haven for a very long time, and yet you play second horn with us. So explain to our viewers the difference, and how there are usually four horns in a typical orchestral setup for most of the larger pieces. Obviously, if we're playing, you mentioned Mahler, you can have eight horns.
Eight horns, right. Yeah, so the horn section is it's unique in the orchestra. I mean, we have four players, but each one of us has an individual part, not like a violin section where you've got multiple people playing one part. And sometimes you will actually see five players on stage, even though there are only four parts, and that fifth player is called the assistant. So each one of us has a particular job. So your principal player mostly will be playing the solo lines and individual solos, and then as a section you'll be playing chords, maybe underneath, sort of supplying the rest of the orchestra with a chordal sound. But each individual player, like the second horn, is paired with the first horn, and we sort of play more of the lower range, but we're sort of function as a pair, especially in classical repertoire. Brahms and Dvorak say the first and second horn are a pair, and the third and fourth horn are a pair. And the second and fourth horn are the low horns. We sort of, in the past, you specialized in lower high horn. Now, most people can do everything, and especially freelancer in New York City, you're pretty expected to be able to play everything. But some people are more suited for high and some for low. So the second and fourth naturally play low, and the first and third are the high horns. And sometimes it'll be pitched in different keys, so that we will be playing in one key, first and second, and the third and fourth will be playing something else. And that explains why sometimes, like in Brahms, you'll see the third horn player playing a very important solo. You think, well, that's unusual. Why wouldn't the principal be playing that? It's because the key at the time, the third horn would be playing in the correct key, had the right crook at the time, or his horn was set up to be able to play in that key for that particular passage. So you sort of would switch off. So basically the first and second are principal and second, and the third and fourth are really principal and second also, in that kind of repertoire. The assistant is playing, and that person sits to the first horn player's left. That person is sort of as a bumper, they call it, for the really loud places. They'll either beef up and all five will be playing, or they give the opportunity for the first horn to take a rest, which is very important when you're playing a very long symphony or a whole program. By the time you get to the end, you're very tired. Horn is sort of a taxing instrument to play nonstop, so that's what the assistant does.
Now, I've heard before that the horn is a really difficult instrument to play. It's one of the hardest orchestral instruments. It's got a life of its own. You can blow into it and do everything right, and yet you never quite know what's coming out the other end.
Well, yeah, well, that's what I guess that's what we like people to think, but it is true. It is true. The horn has a treacherous nature to it, and I think that the personalities of people who play the horn sort of gravitate so that they can sort of handle that, sort of being on a tightrope all the time. The instrument is treacherous because we have a very large range, and it's over 3 octaves. You know, in Shostakovich symphony, you can have a very low pedal note, and in a Haydn symphony, you can have an octave, a note that's almost practically 4 octaves higher than that. So you have this huge range to command, and the range that is the most beautiful for the typical solos, like Tchaikovsky Fifth or something like a song like something like that, or maybe a Mahler symphony. It sort of sits on the top of the staff, and up there the notes are very close together because we're using our lip tension to find each note, and there's sort of an ear-lip connection that when you're playing, you hear the note sort of in advance in your ear, and that makes your lips vibrate at a certain frequency, and then you get the correct note. But when you're really up high, those notes are very, very close together in terms of what they call the overtone series. So we can make a mistake and hit a little bit higher or a little bit lower. And that happens also in all the brass instruments. It's something that can happen. And so, you know, the better you are, the more you practice, I guess the less likely that is to happen.
Treacherous indeed. Let's turn to your love of all things Spanish.
Spanish.
You are not only an accomplished flamenco dancer yourself, but you teach flamenco now. Now, your mother is Spanish. It totally comes from your mother's side of the family?
Yes, my mother's side of the family. My mother's mother was from the Catalan city of Barcelona, and Barcelona is the way they would say it there. And my grandfather was from Peru, and he was part Inca. And actually, some people may be familiar with one of his cousins was Ima Sumac. She was an interesting singer of the time, had one of the largest vocal ranges of any human being. I think she's in the Guinness Book of Records, at least when she was alive. She had this huge vocal range. Anyway, so there was a lot of music in our family, but the Spanish music was, I was always aware of flamenco and that music. And Paso Doble is a kind of music that's played at the beginning of a bullfight. I mean, my family would have bullfights on the TV, so I would hear that music. And so I guess I was always interested in the music, but it was certainly around me. And there was a lot of dancing in the family, Latin families, you know, lots of dancing. And so we were learning different steps, just not formally, and my sister and I would pretend to be flamenco dancers, you know, because of the drama. It was a lot of fun to pretend that, and we had dolls that were flamenco dancers. So I was very aware of it. It wasn't until I started to study guitar that I really got interested. And when I was studying classical guitar, I did study flamenco guitars, which that was sort of my start of learning about the music, which has kept my attention for, 30 years. I've been so interested in that music, and there's always more to learn about it. And since it's not really, there are plenty of books written about flamenco, but the music is taught by that passed down method of, you go to your teacher, they show you, you run home and practice it before you forget it. Now you can video yourself, but that was the original way of learning it. So the passed down nature of it, the tradition has always interested me.
And it really is quite a serious tradition, isn't it? And people take this very seriously. And the great flamenco dancers are really revered.
Oh, yeah. Now, of course, because we have access to being able to see everybody, on the internet, and you get a taste of all the different styles that are out there. And that's one of the things that has kept my interest, is that you could learn a certain bunch of steps, say, that go to a certain song. And then you go to another teacher and learn the same song And their steps may be similar, but they'll have a special way of doing it because they're from a different city, or there's a special way of singing it, and then you have to be aware of what that is. And so there's all these little sort of like almost like little accents, like having an accent from a different part of the United States, you know, that go with the way they dance. So it's constantly interesting to me, the variation, and I'm never bored with what I'm being presented with when I go take a class or watch.
And it looks easy, but I bet it isn't, because you're doing incredibly fast, complicated movements. Is it painful? It looks very hard work.
Painful? I would say it's painful. I mean, you know, I suppose it depends on your feet and your setup, but you know, you always have your knees slightly bent so that you don't hurt yourself. And your feet, yes, they do take a little bit of pounding. And, you know, I suppose you've seen ballet dancers' feet. They take some abuse also. So yes, there's definitely some, I guess, an element of pain, but there's an element of pain in playing the French horn too, you know. So you know, it's difficult to coordinate, to use your feet, to have your body being expressive. If you're adding props, like I play castanets, or like I used a fan in the thing that I did with Stamford recently, or I'm using a manton shawl, they call it a Spanish shawl. I mean, to coordinate all those things together takes a lot of effort and time. You know, I've always been interested in the process of learning these things, not so much the result. And so, you know, I've always enjoyed being immersed in learning how to do something, and turns out, well, at the end, okay, that's great, you know, I can show it to people, but that's been my interest in it.
Now, you've surprised our audience in Stanford on more than one occasion by coming out front and dancing for us. Tell us about the first time that happened.
The first time it was when Eckhart was our conductor, and we did some selections from Carmen Suite. So I was playing in the orchestra in my second horn chair, and I came down to the front. The piece started, I came down the front, I put on my castanets and surprised the audience. I think some people maybe weren't aware that I had walked out of the orchestra, but after I finished dancing, I went back to my seat and played again. So I guess then they were aware that it was me from the orchestra. And then we also did a piece by Carlos Surinach that was already programmed, that I was going to be dancing to a couple of movements from that. And yeah, I got, you know, it's funny, that was a number of years ago, and still when people see me backstage, they are very complimentary and remember that fondly, as do I.
And of course, we saw you most recently last November when Thomas Flippin played the Rodrigo concerto for us. And again, you joined him for the encore. And yes. I think we're going to see a little clip of that at the end of this interview. But Eva, thank you very much indeed for being my guest on my virtual sofa today.
Thank you.
It's a great pleasure.
To see you.
I look forward to the times when we can be back together at the Palace.
Yes, I hope it's soon.
Eva Conti, thank you very much.
Thank you.